In the last couple of videos I've assembled this power supply. It's based on a Riden RD6006 power supply controller. So I just purchased the controller, a switch mode power supply and the enclosure. It's all fitted together fairly well, a few issues which you can see in the last two videos. But fundamentally it's working, it's performing much better than I expected. Nice and accurate, high power, and it's really the high power, high voltage that I wanted. So it will go up to 60 volts at 6 amps, which is obviously a very high power output for a small bench supply. It is small, it's kind of the standard height for desktop equipment, but it's a narrow form factor, so it's quite nice. It doesn't take up a lot of space on the bench. Just for completeness, I wanted to show the software that you can download from the manufacturer's website. Before I do that, I've been asked to go through some of the menu options in a bit more detail, so I'll give a very quick run through of the menu options, what they're for. Some of them aren't particularly clear. There is a very good manual that you can download though. It's in both Chinese and English, but it is nicely written, and the interpretation from Chinese to English has been done very well for the most part. The only bit I found that was a bit amusing was there is a calibration function within the supply, so you can calibrate this supply to make it even more accurate. But it does say in the manual that anyone wanting to do that will need 5.5 multimeters. I think they mean 5.5 digit multimeters. I don't think they're suggesting you get a hacksaw out and start chopping up your meters. But the rest of it is very clear, and it's just really, if you're looking directly at the supply, there's a couple of features that might not make sense straight away. So I thought we'd have a quick look at it before we look at the software. So one of the first things you can do is install your own logo. So I've installed my own startup screen. It is quite nice. You can put in there whatever you want, and so you can customize it and make it your own, so to speak. So to access the menu, it's just Shift, menu key. The first item, the call OK, when you incidentally, in the previous video I said I couldn't get out of this menu other than by going to standby. There's a very obvious way to get out of this once you've figured it out, and that is to press the button and it takes you out of the menu, or at least one step back in the menu. So the first option in the menu was, if you were to select a memory item, you'll get this pop-up window telling you what you're about to load, and then when you press the enter key it loads it. You can turn that pop-up off, and that's what the first option in the menu does. If you set this to the off position, then when you select a memory item, it just goes straight into that setting without showing you the pop-up. I actually prefer to have the pop-up there. It's one extra key press, but it makes it very clear what I'm about to load, so I will be leaving that particular option on. The next one is it's a feature I really don't like, and I definitely will not be using it. If I turn this on and then exit the menu, when you select a stored memory option, either through this pop-up or without this pop-up showing, it turns the output on. So if we select a different memory option, so in this case this is 25 volts at 6 amps, and you select that, it turns the output on, which I really don't like. I think that's potentially a very dangerous feature. As I said in the previous video, it is quite odd that this actually stays on anyway, whatever you set it to do, when you change memory options, and I really think it needs to turn off when you do that. It's very easy when you're concentrating on something you're developing or designing or trying to repair. You want to switch to a different supply setting and you accidentally pick the wrong one, you can blast 60 volts at 6 amps through your small 5 volt device, which I think is a very bad idea. So obviously I will be leaving that particular option off, so I really don't like that. The power on option, that will cause the output to be on whenever you power up the supply. That might be useful if this is being used as a bench supply to power things kind of semi-permanently, then you might want the supply to be on when it's booted up. Again, not a feature I'll be using. Beeper, you can turn the beeper on and off. As you can probably tell, I've turned it off. It is excessively loud. It would be nice if that was a bit quieter. It doesn't need to be anywhere near as loud as it is. The logo, this allows you to bypass the startup logo screen that we saw. If you turn that off, it will just go straight into the supply parameters and not show you the logo. Language, of course, I've got it set to English. There are several other languages. There is a firmware update that adds even more languages. Backlight just adjusts the backlight intensity, so you can go from where you can't see it, which is a bit of a strange setting. Or you might want that if you want the supply to be working in a kind of subdued manner, right up to nice and bright. It is a nice, bright, high contrast display. Then you have the USB interface. You can turn that on and off. You can set the baud rates, the address, that's the port address. You may have more than one of these, so you might want to set those to different addresses if you want to be able to run multiple devices on the same USB bus. You can set the date and time. That is retained through power out if you fit the internal coin cell. The measure option allows you to change the update rate of the main display, and you've got low, medium or high, and you might want to change that if you don't want it to be flickering very quickly, and it can be a bit distracting and annoying if it does that, especially if the voltage is changing a lot. I'm just going to leave it on low, the low setting fairly quickly anyway, so I'll leave that. So moving on to the next screen, once you're in the menu, by the way, and you've got a red highlight, then you need to press the button again to take you one step back, so there's nothing selected on this particular screen, and then you can move on to the next page. So this screen allows you to change the format of the main display. You can change it from the format that we have already seen, which is this format, or we can go in and change it to the alternate form, which is a graphical format, and that gives you this display. So if we turn the supply on, you can see that it's giving you a graph of both the current and the voltage, and if we change the voltage, you'll see that this updates in real time. So it's quite a nice clear display. You can freeze it if you want to, if there's a particular feature that you want to look at, and then restart it. Of course, it might be useful for things like battery charging, or if you're trying to keep an eye on a piece of equipment you're testing that maybe you think has a fault and the current or voltage shouldn't be changing, but it is. I suspect most of the time I will just leave it on the default setting. Okay, the next page will take you through to the memory configuration. So you can either configure the memory here, or you can configure it from the main screen and just explicitly save the settings from the main screen into the various memory slots. I misspoke in the previous email. I said I thought there were 9 memory slots, and obviously there are 10. So you can either come in here and pre-configure the supply, or you can do it as and when you want to from the main display. The last page is simply information about the current system. Currently I have version 1.25 firmware. I believe there's a version 1.26. It didn't seem to add a great deal other than a couple of languages and a few minor updates, so I haven't bothered to update it just yet. If you do run into problems when you're updating the firmware, I believe, I haven't tried it, but I believe that if you hold the enter key in while you power the supply up, I think it enters the bootloader. So if you try to update the firmware and it crashes halfway through and doesn't complete, of course it won't then boot up. So I think what you can do is hold the enter key, power it up, and it should go into the bootloader and allow you to try again. Okay, so that's it for the menu. As I say, to get out, you just press the button. Fairly straightforward. You do have a lock function as well, so you can lock the display, so you can't do anything. It tells you that it's locked, and you can see the symbol at the top right corner is showing it as locked. To unlock, just select the same function again. Okay, so that's the menu system on the supply itself. So we'll have a look at the software and see how that works. So to use the software, we plug in a USB cable. This plugs into the socket on the front of the supply. and the other end obviously of course plugs into your PC. So I'll switch to the view on the PC, but I'll keep the display in the corner of the screen so we can see what it's doing. I'll also hook up a battery so that we can test the battery charging function as well, and we can do that from the software. So this is a 6-cell lithium polymer battery, and what you'll see is that it will detect that we've got a battery connected. So you can see that the battery symbol has turned red. Incidentally, I was asked what this tick symbol means, and that's the protection status. If this overheats or goes into a protection mode, it will shut down the supply, and then this tick will turn red, and it will show you that there's an issue and it's got into shutdown mode. Okay, so I've got the battery connected. We'll now look at the software and see how that works. Okay, so when you install the software, you have to install a USB driver. It took a couple of attempts on my machine to get it to work properly. But once I got it installed and working, you start up the software, you click on the connect button, and if all goes well, you'll see it will connect. Okay, so once it's connected, you'll see the various parameters appear. Now, unfortunately, this software is fairly flaky. It's obviously fairly new software, hasn't been particularly fully developed, so you might find you do have to stop it and start it quite a bit. It's very unlikely I will use this very much. I tend not to need software for power supplies other than doing specific types of testing. It's quite good for logging data, that sort of thing. Apparently there's also an app for this for the smartphone or tablet. I don't really know what use that would have. If anyone has a use for that sort of thing, then please leave a comment and let me know what it is. But what you in theory should be able to do now is adjust the voltages and currents from here. It's not very easy to use, to be honest. I don't particularly like it. In this case, it's not actually letting me change anything. So the operation from software is not particularly good. The limit it's showing here is for some reason it's 10 volts. I don't really know why it's doing that. It seems to default to various things that aren't the same as what is on the supply. So we're getting max value here. If I try and change this I'll change it to 60 volts. I can then change the settings, but as I say, this doesn't relate to what the current settings are on the supply, which would be nice if it did that. I can't see any reason why it's not doing that. But once you've done that, you can then start changing the voltage to whatever you want within the allowable range. So for our particular battery, I want to set this to 25.2 volts, and I want the current to be 6.1 amps, but again I need to change this to match what is on the supply. It doesn't do it automatically. So once I've done that, I'll plug the battery into the supply. You see that on both the supply and in the software it detects that the battery is connected, gives us the current voltage, and we can now switch the supply on and it should start charging. And it has indeed done that, and the supply, as you can see, is indicating that it's running. I won't go through too much of this. It's all fairly self-explanatory. You can synchronize the time, so if I click on this, you'll see that the time and date automatically synchronize. As I say, it is a bit flaky in the way it works. Sometimes things seem to work, sometimes they don't. I wouldn't want to use this remotely. I'm never particularly confident that the supply has actually done what I've asked it to from the software. I'm sure it will get better as it's developed further. Again, one feature I don't like, once you're connected, the on-off button on the supply no longer works. You have to disconnect for that to do anything. So if the application crashes, then the only way to turn the supply off is to pull out the USB cable or try to restart the software, but it doesn't always restart and connect. So that's a bit of a poor design feature. I think the on-off button on the supply should always work. That's a safety feature. If you do something on the device you're trying to repair or design and you quickly want to turn the supply off, you hit this button and it's not going to do anything, and trying to mess about with the mouse to get down to the off button is obviously going to take quite some time, and by that time your circuit's probably destroyed, so you're going to end up pulling the cables out in an emergency, which is not ideal. You've got the graph showing the voltage and current, and as I say, the rest of it is fairly intuitive. You can select different settings, so I'll stop the battery charging, I'll disconnect it, and we can now select the various data configurations, and this does work. You just pick whatever you want. You can change these from the software. You can adjust the backlight. You can also get into various update screens, so you can update the firmware. As I say, there is a newer version of the one I have, and it does tell you down here what the differences are in the new version. This is where you can change your startup logo. You can update the software, of course. Select the language that the supply is using and that the software is using, and then the general about. As I said, there is a calibration feature in here. You can enter a password. It tells you in the manual what the password is, and once you get in, you can adjust the accuracy of the supply to tweak the supply to read exactly what the actual supply is giving out. It is a readback supply by the look of it, so it does seem to read back the voltage it's providing. As you can see, it is what it is. It's fairly simple, it's functional. It could do with some additional work. I don't particularly like this type of interface, but that's just personal preference. I don't really think I'll be using this very much, but I do like the supply. I think it was well worth the money I spent on it. They do vary a great deal from what I've seen, but I paid a total of less than £100 for all the parts I needed to buy. And for that I've got a 360 watt bench supply. It gives me anything from 0 to 60 volts up to 6 amps, and it has a resolution of 1 milliamp and 10 millivolts. It has some nice memory features, constant voltage, constant current modes, and that's mostly what I want out of a bench supply. It is single supply, of course, but at that price I could afford to buy 5 or 6 for what I paid for the Riden supply. It's not up to the standard of the Riden. It is nicer to use than the Riden. As I say, I do not like the front panel layout of the Riden. I think it's a misguided layout that they need to rethink. But certainly this particular supply, well worth the money. And again, just to reiterate, I'm not affiliated with the manufacturers or suppliers. I'm just trying to give an honest appraisal of this supply, what I bought, the issues I had assembling it, and how it performs and behaves. Comments welcome. Anyone else that's had experience with these, or if you've come across any issues, then please let me know.